What's up, fucker? It's your boy, Jack Slack, Fights Gone By podcast. Coming at you on Monday the 24th of August. Following a weekend with UFC and a Bellator and a big boxing match between Whyte and Povetkin. Everyone's second favourite Dillian. And we've got some news. So let's do some news first, then we'll have a talk about the fights. Because there's actually a pretty good amount this week, and we haven't done some in a while. So, firstly, you got the weird news that Ryan Hall is out of this fight with Ricardo Lamas this weekend. Bit of a bummer, I'm going to be honest, because we don't get to see Ryan fight that often. Ryan and Ricardo Lamas are two of my favourite MMA grapplery types, two of my favourite in the featherweight division. So yeah, I haven't heard anything regarding why Ryan's out, but yeah, I mean, that's just a bit of a damp squib on my weekend. But in terms of signings this week, we got Till versus Hermansson booked for December 5th. That sounds like a banger. Obviously, Till coming off a loss to Robert Whittaker, but not a particularly bad one. And Hermansson just got back on track by submitting Kelvin Gastelum very quickly. Overwhelmingly, Hermansson's best striking seems to happen against southpaws, so that's quite interesting in terms of the matchup on the feet. And then the matchup on the ground is always interesting because it's Hermansson, and Till's been pretty good at staying off the floor. Elsewhere in that middleweight division, you got Darren Stewart versus Kevin Holland booked for September 19th. Darren Stewart just signed a big 4-fight contract, apparently. I mean, him and those are two guys who are just, well, at the moment it seems at least like if the UFC has cleared you to fight once during this pandemic, they will go to you and just stock the cards with you over and over again. And that seems to be what's happening with both Stewart and Holland. So they're going to be, when we get to the end of all this nonsense, they're going to have 4 fights racked up while a load of dudes who coming out of Russia or Asia or Europe are going to have no fights over this period. But that's a compelling little fight. Holland looked fantastic in his last one. Darren Stewart looked good in his last one. He hit that beautiful guillotine. Yeah, I just put that in because it was interesting. And then for laughs, BKFC, Bare Knuckle FC, returns on September 11th. Yeah, with Baroni versus Alves to commemorate the 9/11 attacks. And firstly, that's a weird ass fight because Baroni was so washed and chinny at the point that Alves was good that, I mean, has Alves caught up with it? Alves is about the most legit fighter I can think of going to BKFC. You know, he's still, I mean, he's very much long in the tooth on the downside of his career, but he's very good still as a striker, that is. I wouldn't call his drop-off as bad as like Johnny Hendricks's, who also did BKFC. But that's quite funny because they're doing September 11th. Bellator has a September 11th and September 12th card. And do you remember Glenn Beck did that stupid thing that was like the September 12th project or the 9/12 project or whatever it was? He was like, I want to capture that feeling that we had after 9/11, the day after. And nothing could capture that feeling for many people like watching a Bellator card. And then there's just the dog shit news. You got Megan Anderson versus Amanda Nunes finally signed at UFC 256. The UFC pulled the trigger on it, being like, well, it's not going to get any more sensible. If we give Megan any other fight, she'll lose. So let's just get her in with Amanda Nunes now, while she's at least got a win in the can. And then Courtney Casey versus Priscilla Cachoeira has been booked for Halloween. Yeah, I mean, basically a freebie for Courtney Casey, unless she's much worse than I estimate her to be. Oh, and then I don't know if we actually it might have happened after our last podcast, but John Jones said he was moving to heavyweight, dropping the title. So that means that this fight between Jan Blachowicz and Dominic Reyes is now for the light heavyweight title. I mean, yeah, it would have been a 5-rounder anyway, probably. So it doesn't really make a lot of difference, but interesting nonetheless. So anyway, we had some fights this weekend. Before we get into the UFC one, let's just touch on that Povetkin versus Whyte match. You know, if you don't know who Dillian Whyte is, he's an absolute monster of a man. He's like a modern day Sonny Liston in some respects, being gigantic and black. But he has been like number one contender on the WBC. Is it the WBC's list of rankings for something like 3 years, or close to the number one contender? And also, so that's Deontay Wilder's title, and then also for one of Anthony Joshua's as well. So he's in 2 sets of rankings. But he was there for ages, like waiting for a title shot at someone. He lost a fight with Anthony Joshua coming up. That was a big deal, but that was his only loss. He then, as far as I can remember, he fought some guy, and they got the positive drug test back ahead of the fight and just went ahead with the fight, not telling anyone. But anyway, he's been in limbo for a while. He was fighting Povetkin, who is older than the hills. Old ass Russian dude. Looks like he's made out of wood, like Dan Henderson. Just the way he moves. It's a little bit sort of... Every movement should be accompanied by either a groan or a dad noise, like when you pick something up and you go, whoop! But it was a good little banger. Actually, someone was asking me the other day in one of those... In a question, which I think I answered the first half of, forgot to answer the second half of, so I just cut out the second part of their question in the edit. But they asked how to land right hooks more effectively. And I was going to say, probably not a great punch in MMA. And, you got the overhand going over the jab, which is slightly angled, and we'll get into this later when we talk about Pedro Munoz versus Frankie Edgar. But like a right hook coming across like a left hook, kind of difficult. It's sort of like a speciality punch, or really of use when guys square up. So if you saw this fight, they were both squaring up to each other, bending low at the waist, and sneaking right hooks behind each other's gloves because they were standing square, doing this sort of infighting stuff. Heavyweight infighting. That's why I say infighting stuff. But yeah, Povetkin was... he started out okay, looked a bit wooden. Then he kept going to the body, and each time he swung to the body with his right hand or threw a right uppercut, Dillian Whyte would turn his head around with... It was like a left hook counter to a right uppercut, but it was basically like a hammer fist across the jaw. That was the kind of distance it was covering. It was about 4 or 5 inches, and he's knocking Povetkin down with it. Knocked him down twice in the same round. And you're like, Jesus Christ, the power on these lads. But Povetkin comes out for... What was it, like round 6, round 7? I can't remember when the knockout happened. But it comes out, throws a quick right hook to the body, steps back, jabs Whyte in the forearm and slips to inside position to his left. And as Whyte is like loading up to hit him, Povetkin pops his head up with a left uppercut. And it was absolutely beautiful. He stiffens him like a board. Guy just falls back. Povetkin, I'm going to say, seems like a good guy. Because he stood around for ages waiting to see that Dillian Whyte was okay, rather than running around the ring celebrating, which seems to be a thing with like Eastern European athletes. They seem to care about bad sportsmanship about as much as we care about steroids, in the West, or pretend to care about steroids in the West. But this uppercut, I got shades of tingles. Got tingles watching it. Now I got shades of Jersey Joe, my boy Jersey. If you've been listening to this podcast or following me for any length of time, you know that I am probably the biggest mark alive for Jersey Joe Walcott. Had some really strange looks, and he used to do a lot of inside slips to left uppercuts. And he'd do it throwing his right arm out and his left arm out too, like he was doing a clown pose or something, like ta-da! And then he'd come up with the left uppercut from inside your jab. But he had like a really low rate of success with it. It is the right... I just said the right hook's a bit of a speciality punch, but the left uppercut, or if you are an orthodox fighter against an orthodox fighter, left uppercut is a tricky punch. Jack Dempsey said like there's barely any time he would throw a left uppercut unless his feet were completely square, and so he wasn't actually in either stance. Because it's hard to throw bladed and land, and if you square up a bit more, you have to be really in close to do it. Plus, the problem with any uppercut is that to connect, the guy has to be head slightly forward of hips at least. Now, Povetkin got his man, bending over. Walcott managed to do it on Ezard Charles, who was upright and jabbing, which is even more impressive. And that is probably the best heavyweight knockout ever, in my humble and completely biased opinion. The Jersey Joe Ezard Charles 3, I believe, knockout. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. But he basically just dances, he strolls up to Ezard Charles and slips the punch perfectly. It's they fought something like 20 rounds up to that point, and they had 3 fights, and they basically fought entire pro careers against each other at that point. And he just sort of waltzes up, knows the jab's coming, slips his head to the inside, and uppercuts him, and walks off, and pivots off and walks away as Ezard Charles just slumps down on the floor. And it's one thing to be like, yeah, I've got him. If you're like Mark Hunt and you hit him the first time, you go, yep, that's the knockout. And even Mark Hunt got that wrong sometimes. But to do that as someone who's not a knockout artist against a guy you've been the distance twice with already, that's pretty weird. But cool. Even cooler than what Mark Hunt does. That's what I'll say. But yes, Povetkin's punch reminded me of that a lot. Anyway, let's talk about UFC fights. You had Edgar versus Munoz. And if you're a Patreon boy, you hopefully will have read the tactical guide I did earlier this week. I didn't do a tactical guide to both men. I thought, fuck it, let's focus on Pedro Munoz. I've done so much stuff on Frankie Edgar in the past because basically his run at the top coincides with my time writing. You know, I think I started one of the first pieces I did at Bloody Elbow must have been about Frankie Edgar. But yeah, he's been around forever, and I've been talking about him forever because he's consistently good. So I focused on Pedro Munoz, and we talked about how he's just had this really weird career path. We didn't do a late podcast last week, so I'll talk about it here. But if you watch him come into the UFC, his striking consisted entirely of low kicks, and he was really good at kicking the leg, and then as the opponent caught it at their thigh, he'd point his knee out, kick the leg over, and limp leg out. Well, not limp leg, but we'll call it a limp leg here. I don't know what the Thai term is for it, but you know how to free your leg off a low kick. And if you watch like the fight with Gerard Sanders, he kicks Sanders in the leg. Sanders grabs the kick, tries to shoot on him. Munoz is already limp-legged out, is on both feet and sprawls on him, and then from there picks up the guillotine. It was like the perfect play out of that plan for Munoz. But you can watch him against like Damian Stasiak, where he just went forward, kicking the leg, and then Stasiak could try and take him down, and he'd sit down on the guillotine and either use it to sweep or come up on the front headlock. It was very strange because he had this pressure fighting style, but without pressure fighting weapons. So he was going forward, kicking the leg, and not doing much else. And if he met people who didn't want to shoot on him and could strike, they'd just bloody him up. They'd punch him in the face a load. And it takes him getting cracked in the face a few times in a fight to realize that the other guy isn't going to knock him out. And then he starts throwing his hands, and he does a lot better. And his hands aren't great. I think the main problem with his hands is that he doesn't throw in combination very well. But he did do a great job of timing Cody Garbrandt, making him... That was a really weird fight because Pedro Munoz fought completely... a game plan completely removed from his usual game. So instead of walking forward and trying to pressure the guy, he's taking steps back. He's making the distance greater than it usually is. He's hacking in the low kick, like down at the ankle sometimes. And he's making Cody come to him. So one time Cody steps in and he punts him in the leg as he does so, buckling his knee. The next time he slips his head inside and throws the right hand over the top. Because Cody Garbrandt, very, very fast. But, you know, if his hands are too fast for you to see and react to, his feet aren't. If you put him out at long range, he still has to step in first. And funnily enough, it was basically, he took what Garbrandt did to Cruz and did it to Garbrandt. But three things really made it more effective. Getting more comfortable throwing hands. Like the first round and a half against Dodson, he was useless. He's walking forward, throwing kicks. Dodson's picking them up and just blasting him straight down the centre with punches. And then by getting punched in the face a load of times by John Dodson, he goes, oh wait, he's not going to knock me out. I'm going to start swinging hands. And he starts to pull the fight back to more even towards the end. But then he also he changed from the thigh kick to the low kick. Which, you know, obviously in MMA seems to be more generally seems to be more damaging to the guy in the short term than the kick to the thigh, which guys can just take hundreds of. And he added like a really nice front kick to the body. But what I said in that was that I'm very interested to see how the guillotine and the threat of the guillotine affect Edgar's game. Because Edgar, if you remember the three fights where he really struggled getting guys down, most notably, Holloway, Aldo, both Aldo fights actually, and Ortega. These are the recent examples at least. Once his takedowns stopped working, his striking became less effective as a result. And the Ortega one stands out as the odd one because where he went back to the takedowns against Holloway and Aldo, because they were just fighting off the takedowns, he didn't go back to it against Ortega, who threatened the guillotine. He got a bit spooked. And then he ended up in this one-note stand-up where the level change isn't that threatening anymore, and he's just sort of trying to kickbox awkwardly with a massive reach and height disadvantage normally. So I was intrigued. I said at the end of that piece, it'd be very interesting to see if Munoz's guillotine and the threat of it can spook Edgar early. Now, what happened was that Edgar didn't seem to be that bothered by the guillotine, which might be something to do with the height difference, but he was taking his shots well. He did get Munoz down a couple of times. And to Munoz's credit, he had more than just the guillotine to defend the takedown with. He was doing nice things like he was going for the guillotine, switching off, well, literally, going to the switch when Edgar was holding tight and he couldn't get the guillotine on. And then he'd go back to the guillotine if Edgar started backing his hips out away from the switch. It was really nice, yeah. But Edgar did keep using the level changes, and it seemed to work as well as you could hope without like just bundling the dude over whenever you want to. So what you got was this weird sort of performance where Munoz was pressuring forward the entire time, but where, I mean, I rate the Jeremy Stephens fight very highly on Edgar technical performances, and I was listening to Heavy Hands last week, and they do too. And one of the reasons is that he was dealing with this huge hitter. The guy was much bigger than him, even though Edgar had been a lightweight and Stephens has always been a featherweight. But massive power disadvantage, very hard guy to take down. Edgar managed to, while being backed up, hit Stephens convincingly enough that Stephens would throw back, open up, and then Edgar could get on his hips and take him down. Munoz didn't really open up like that. What happened with Munoz was that he was pressuring forward, so he was there for Edgar to hit, but Edgar wasn't really hurting him very much, but he also wasn't getting wild, so the takedowns weren't there. So you got this strange fight where Munoz is walking forward, Edgar's throwing 4-punch combinations and hitting him, and then Munoz will hit him 1 or 2 back. Which, I mean, is a fairly entertaining dynamic for a fight to take on. But one of the things that stood out to me when I was looking through Munoz's fights was that his jab can be quite good sometimes, but he doesn't really have a lot of uses for it. And in this one, it looked quite, like when he went to it, it looked sharp. He does that thing where he'll put his shoulder in slowly, like, and then he'll pop the jab out straight from the shoulder. There's like that little preparatory movement. But it seemed to work really well. Like, it's not necessarily bad, that sort of load up. GSP does it, one of the best jabbers in MMA history. Robert Whittaker does it. It's where you'll like maybe lower your level a little bit or put your shoulder in just a little bit slower, and then you do a little pause and then you snap the jab out from the shoulder. And it works really well. Also means that you're not throwing your hand out there against guys who are just going to move at the first sign of trouble. You prepped them with the little fake. And of course it speaks to that thing we're always talking about changing up speed and dynamic. And the other thing Munoz was doing with his jab was that he was often throwing out vertical fist, so he wasn't twisting his hand, which was really interesting. Because Frankie Edgar's corner, I think I heard them say, even when you're moving laterally, threaten him with your wrist. I heard wrist, could be something different that they said, but they could have been talking about that fake where you just turn your right hand from its usual position to palm down with a fist, so that the guy thinks a punch is coming. It's a really short fake or feint, doesn't take a lot of effort, but you can do it while you're moving, which is nice. So there's two uses, there's showing the guy the twist of the wrist to make him think the punch is coming when it isn't, and there's not twisting the wrist so that he doesn't see the punch coming. A lot of this fight was Edgar circling to his right and Munoz throwing that low kick, and it was just sort of like, think back to when you broke something as a child and you'd scamper out of the room as your dad was like, get out of here, you little shit, and give you like a kick on the arse, but you're moving in the same direction as the kick, so it's not really a kick, it's more like ushering you out of the door. But that's sort of what was happening a lot of the time. He wasn't catching him dead to rights with the kick. He's sort of catching him circling away. And the other thing that I it's always kind of annoyed me about Edgar is that he does go to the body consistently, but he does it with just like arm punches. So he'll level change and just like put his right hand on your midsection, almost to be like, boop, gotcha, cover that. It's never like, you never see guys wincing from Frankie Edgar hitting them in the body. Scorecards were all over the place for this one. I don't have a really very strong view, but Frankie Edgar gets the win. Pedro Munoz gets the loss. I mean, but it's bantamweight, so we can book it however we want. I would say, especially when I was listening to Cruz heap praise on Frankie throughout this fight, I was thinking, I've always wanted to do Aldo Cruz, and I think there's no better time to do that than now when they both still want fights. Obviously, Cruz refuses to fight for anything that's not a title, but it would be interesting to have that fight. Also, totally justifiable main event. Like, that's a great fight in terms of interest in it. But more than that, we don't want to see Aldo versus Edgar 3, which I guarantee you would play out the same way as the first two, with Frankie Edgar running in on a line and not quite working out why he's missing Jose Aldo as he pivots off. And I say that as someone who loves Frankie Edgar. But do Cruz versus Edgar. That'd be great fun, I think. That's an old man fight we can all get behind. And speaking of old men, let's do Bellator main event first, so that we'll go down the cards. But Ryan Bader lost his light heavyweight title to Vadim Nemkov. And I thought Nemkov looked real good in this. I thought he had I'd seen him fight against Liam Magiri back, was that last year? And I'd seen him fight against Phil Davis. But I forgot a lot of what that fight was, and I went back to watch it this week. And Bellator's video player, like, no matter where you set your VPN to, they're just like, nah, you're not having it, mate. Which was a real shame. But he did a great job in this one. He came out, he immediately put Bader on the back foot so that Bader can't do like the long distance level change and then come in with the overhand left hook. But yeah, Bader looked really uncomfortable throughout the whole fight. Wasn't getting hit too cleanly until he ate a right hand, I think, in the second round. But he did hit a nice reactive double leg in the first round, took him down. Played on top for a bit. Nemkov did well using a Kimura as Bader was trying to force half to get back to closed guard, or rather to get his knees back inside and start threatening like a triangle or an omoplata, which made Bader pretty ineffective on top. But the commentary team, within a minute later, Big John's like, Bader hasn't gone to his wrestling not one time. And you're just listening to it going, what? It's actually really, I mean, I'm always moaning about it. Actually really hard to focus on what's going on when the guys are talking about something completely unrelated to it. It's actually easier to watch it on mute. And actually, on the subject of Bellator commentary, I didn't watch Julia Budd versus the number 75th ranked pound-for-pound woman in the Pacific Northwest, or whatever it was. But I did watch Roy Nelson versus... Fuck, hold on, let me look his name up. Valentin Moldavsky, who apparently is also Fedor team. But they were just going on and on about Roy Nelson's power and how he'll end the fight in one shot. And you're going, he hasn't done that since 2015, 2016, lads. He's on a 5-fight losing streak. And as they pointed out at the start, he's come in the heaviest of his career. And I mean, like, I've seen Roy Nelson be effective at bigger weights. I'm not gonna fat shame him, but he looked like he didn't train for this. It looked really bad. There's Pudgy Guy doing well in the heavyweight division, and then there's Rampage Jackson against Fedor. And that's what Roy Nelson looked like. He looked like he was just there to pick up a paycheck. But Moldavsky basically worked him over with what Josh Barnett did, but 5 years later and not as well. Honestly, I mean, we tickle Josh's balls a little bit on this podcast because he's one of my favourite heavyweights as a technician, and I put so much hate on the heavyweight division generally for how bad they are technically and tactically and strategically and as athletes conditionally. But I'm going to stop there because I could keep going. But Barnett's fights with Mir and Nelson, really nice dirty boxing. You hear so many people talk about dirty boxing, and it wasn't like, you don't really see a lot of technical improvement over time in dirty boxing. But Barnett's fights with Mir and Nelson, fantastic. John Jones's fight against Glover Teixeira, his work against Daniel Cormier in the clinch along the fence. Yeah, it's a big untapped area of that you can really hurt people in. But Moldavsky did that by just like putting his head on Roy Nelson and throwing little spazzy uppercuts that weren't actually doing much. Whereas when you watch Barnett do it, he I was about to say he was in flow state. Fucking hate that. But, you know, he was really like working one grip, changing off. But as he changed off to a different underhook or double wrist tie or whatever, he'd hit him in the face while he did it. And then he'd change on a double leg. And then he'd come up and take the underhook again. It was really smooth stuff. But yeah, the Big John Goldie podcast was okay this week. Actually, on that card, also John Salter won by arm triangle against Andrew Capel, and then hopping back to the UFC, his boy, I believe he trained Zaleski, but yeah, didn't put out a second podcast last week. I thought, got to do something fun, so I said, who's on this card? Austin Hubbard. I like him. He does some interesting things. Make a Filthy Casuals quickie, talking about some of the stuff he does. Really interesting things in terms of anti-grappling, because he's fought guys like Davy Ramos and Marco Madsen and Max Roskopf, all very grappling-heavy fighters, or at least that's where their strengths are. And Hubbard obviously lost to two of them, just beat up Max Roskopf before this, but he was doing some interesting things in both of them, staying low, you know, where a lot of successful strikers have moved towards a more movement-based style to limit the opportunities for their opponent to shoot. He's staying lower, using his hands to frame on people, level changing with them, using the body jab as a weapon really well, which we always love against grapplers because that's just like an iron bar between your hips and theirs. Using up jabs and uppercuts to start combinations to stand the opponent up and then throw a kick afterwards, and ending his combinations with a knee, always like a high knee, which often whiffs up in front of the opponent, but even that, if they see it, that'll stop him level changing as readily. You know, if you watch his second and third round against Madsen, that's really where you start to see that coming together. And then against Roscoff, he whips his ass. But now this is the thing. I thought, those are interesting things that are stylistically fairly unique, and I think that other people can use or would be able to use really well. Pop out a video on that. Of course, if Slacky says, watch out for this fighter, he's pretty good, does a Filthy Casuals guide, they immediately lose. and I'm saying immediately, like Joe Selecki's on his back, he's fighting the hands, then he's just getting choked. But Selecki, honestly, I must have seen this lad before because he's in the UFC and he's been finishing people. But for whatever reason, he's just not stuck in my head. He has now. Because to do that when Davy Ramos and Marco Madsen and Max Roskopf couldn't, really impressive. Got the back. It wasn't actually immediate. He did it. He struck well first. Like he was competent on the feet, I thought, and then he entered. Somehow Hubbard ended up showing his back, which he's done against Madsen, he did it against Ramos, he did against Roskopf. Very good at turning the back, fighting the hands, getting back out into the open. But what you saw Selecki do was, I think, I've seen Aljamain Sterling do this too, but where guys will put one hip against the fence so that you can't put the hook in on that side, and then they'll be fighting you on the other side by closing you out with their elbow and their knee. Think Robert Whittaker, he's brilliant at this, did it to Jacare and Yoel Romero. But Selecki just pulled him off the fence a little bit, just enough to throw the hook in on that side. Which is, if you're building up and you're doing it methodically, that side's already taken care of. And he just yanked him away for a little bit, threw that hook in, climbed up on him. It reminded me a lot of the Corey Sandhagen Aljamain Sterling back take, though I think he used a broomstick to pull him off balance and then threw in the hook on the fence side second. But I was well impressed. And then you saw him fight lots of stuff from the standing back position, which is, you see it in MMA because guys use the fence to hold themselves up. But one of the interesting things about this, if you noticed when all that hand fighting was happening, because I saw people going like, Hubbard didn't even know how to fight the hands. And you're like, you really? But if you saw the hand fighting happening, both of Selecki's hands were over Hubbard's shoulders for most of that portion, which I was actually the other day, I was watching something with Gordon Ryan where he was talking about this. Typically, you want an over and an under, as pioneered by Marcelo Garcia, but it means that you can fight the hand or the wrist or control the wrist on one side, on your underside, and you can fight the neck. You can go for the neck on your overside. If you put both hands over, you get into a position where the guy can more easily slip his head underneath one of your elbows and get his head to the mat on that side. And so on the ground, there are times when you would go both hands over, but most of the time you want one hand under and one hand over, and you're fighting for hand control and for the throat. In this one, Selecki was upright on his back, standing, and he was able to just take both hands over the shoulders at a lot of points. So that was really interesting. I mean, if you want to watch that finish again, he does a lot of two hands over the shoulder stuff. But I believe he's a black belt under John Salter, which is what made me make that link. But yes, I mean, that just shows that grappling and MMA grappling still very different things. And of course, if you get purchased on a good position, it gets harder to fight back from there, What else was interesting on this card? Mizuki Inoue versus Amanda Lemos stood out to me because Lemos seemed like she could crack, which is obviously very rare in the women's divisions, particularly 115. And Mizuki Inoue, she was the darling of the MMA media back when she was in Invicta. Because she's got quite smooth hands. But what you noticed in this one over and over again was that her hands were as smooth as butter, but had about the same effectiveness as if she was spreading butter on Lemos's face. She was throwing lovely smooth combinations and they weren't doing shit. So she did a lot of leaning on the fence, but then she was using her head to try and stand Lemos up, and Lemos would slide in the double collar tie, both wrists in front of the collarbones. And Inoue would back up rather than push in. So she'd end up in a double collar tie worse than she was before. But props to Inoue because she's taking corner advice from Aljamain Sterling in a second language with a mask on. I was watching going, can she understand a word? Even in your first language, it can be pretty hard to hear people through a mask. So fair enough to her. But Aljamain Sterling was saying, we're down 2 rounds, we need a finish. And Inoue was like, I'm going to lean on her. So maybe she didn't know she was down 2 rounds. But Lemos, keep an eye on her. Seemed interesting. But elsewhere on this card, tons of finishes. Daniel Rodriguez versus Dwight Grant was nuts. That was the one where Rodriguez took a beating. And you're going, interesting choice to let this fight carry on. And then he knocks Grant down and almost immediately it's a stoppage. Was it Jordan Wright who did the dope-ass wheel kick while backing up against Ike Villanueva. Grabbed a collar tie and started kneeing him and opened up a cut. And it was a really early cut stoppage, which always sucks. But the backing up wheel kick was incredibly cool. And that's something you're seeing more from traditional martial arts and point fighting. Not even traditional martial arts, like point fighting stuff. Spinning techniques as counters. It's a really big deal because you know the guy's moving onto them. It's a lot easier. The really only 2 times I would recommend, or I would, if you're trying to get good at using spinning techniques and you're already competent, but you're not, like, you haven't been doing spinning kicks since you were born or whatever, the best time to do turning techniques along the fence on offense, if the guy's circling out past your lead leg, spin and hit him. And then the other time is if you're backing up and you're drawing them in. Because you know that those are the times where you can predict what they're doing, or you have at least a read on what they're doing. You know that you're not gonna spin and they're gonna move back or move in and take you back. You've got them moving in, you know what sort of pace they're moving in, you hit them to where they're moving in. Or you've got them circling past your lead leg, you know where they're going, you kick them there. Trying to get those little glimmers of predictable action in a largely chaotic environment. Shayna Dobson beat up Maria Agapova after Agapova just spazzed out for the first round. Mike Rodriguez's knockout of Prachnio was good, but Prachnio looked really... Was he Hardonk's boy? They were going on about someone being like a kickboxing prodigy, but I was very surprised if it was this guy because he looked really uncomfortable. And then the crazy one was Timur Valiev versus Trevin Jones. And that just sums up, in a nutshell, why fighting is the most interesting sport, because Valiev kicked his ass for a round and a minute and then got knocked out. And Valiev was really interesting, kept changing it up, going front kick to the body, question mark kick upstairs, or Brazilian kick or whatever you want to call it, Maha Moashigeri. Beautiful straight shooting with his 1s and 2s, just beating the shit, making Trevin Jones look crap. And then Trevin Jones times him kicking, steps in, right hook on the jaw, and what you got was like Valiev went to guard, and it was almost like he told himself, okay, stay calm. And he stayed too calm, and the guy just punched him in the face a load of times. Because, it's very easy to be like, people don't get stopped from full guard. You're still with it. then, the guy starts punching you from full guard. Just looked a little bit too chill. Maybe he was more out of it than he looked. But this card was largely cursed. There was a ton of cancellations. You had Takashi Sato off the card. Romero versus Hall was originally decided to be on this card, and Romero got injured. Ovinson Prut, like an hour before the fight was going ahead, Ovinson Prut, I think he got the Rona. I think he tested negative all week and then got the Rona. Michelle Waterson versus Angela Hill was rescheduled from this one. In fact, Trevin Jones was the last minute replacement for Mark Striegel. So yeah, just bonkers cards. I mean, fighting in the time of Corona, we're always talking about it, but cannot wait for this shit to be over. Was that a rhyme? Did I just spit hot fire? Yeah, so, I mean, we've got fights coming up later in the week, but we'll talk about that later in the week. Let's do a couple of questions before we get out of here for today. All hail, Slack of Slacks. Fan for a while and recent Patreon boy here. I'm fresh out of secondary school and currently looking for work in this difficult climate with no intention of going to university. By far my strongest passion in life is my love for all things MMA and combat sports. I was wondering if you could shed some light on how one goes about becoming an analyst or generally makes a career in the sport other than the obvious face-punching route. I love your content and can imagine myself doing similar work in future, but I'm not sure how to get there. Any guidance would be much appreciated. Insert ironic Valentina simp here. Christian, you've already got the memes down. Just take my memes and run with them. When I'm inducted into the MMA Hall of Fame as a Nat Fleischer type figure, they can talk about all the memes I created and how I led the MMA journalist revolution towards more memes. But if you're going into it, I mean, any creative field, my advice to you would be, I am someone who's already had some success in this field, which kind of makes me like if, LeBron goes and talks to inner city kids and it's like play basketball and get out of the ghetto or whatever. But I will give you my take at least. And I would say first things first, I didn't plan to do this as a career or anything. I already had a job and I was just doing this for fun on the side. And then very fortunately, people liked my stuff enough that I got picked up by sites and I was able to make some money doing the thing I loved. But then don't ever forget that if you do transition to doing something as a career or something you're doing fairly full time, it becomes your occupation. What's that old fucking Robert Frost one? My avocation and vocation. I seek to make one or some bollocks. That one about him chopping wood, Or at least you're going to need to know if you're going to be a writer. No, just fucking around. But, when people are always like, I would love to do my passion for a living. But when you're doing your passion for a living, it's still your living. When you start doing this more full time, it can wear on you. You get burnt out on doing stuff like that. And that has happened to me in the past. When I was doing 3 pieces a week for Fightland, I went down to 2 and then did 3 on good weeks when I was feeling motivated. By the time that Fightland and Vice Sports and all that started cutting people and stuff. But, it used to be that I would watch all the fights at the weekend because that was what I did for fun. But once that becomes your job, it feels like your job is intruding on your weekend, even if you're not, even if that is what you would have been doing for fun if this weren't your job. So yeah, that's just like a cautionary, don't expect everything to be sparkles and rainbows if you get a job doing the thing you love. And of course, burnout is very, very easy to stumble into, and you probably will at some point if you end up doing this as your job. I'm in the very fortunate position where I've managed to go independent now, almost by accident, but it's allowing me to work at my own pace, doing my own things, and writing for people who want to read about stuff that I'm interested in on whatever card, whatever fighter I'm interested in, then people are like, oh, well, there must be a reason, rather than having to do just the stuff that everyone else is going to be doing and getting burned out that way. But if you're at the beginning, obviously the path up tends to be working for a small site and then working for a bigger site and going up that way. Obviously very tricky. If you follow any of the movings and shakings in the MMA media, there's always people cutting a load of staff, other people picking up a load of staff. It's a turbulent job. But what I would say is find interesting things to say, not like clickbaity bollocks, Side note, Sherdog this week are fighting over something that I said at the end of an article about Don Fry 4 years ago. They took half the sentence, put it as the headline, and then all the responses are like, oh, fucking Jack Slack clickbaiting as usual. And you're like, that wasn't my title. But yeah, have something interesting to say, or at least some interesting information to provide. And that doesn't mean like you have to know everything about jiu-jitsu or striking or have trained martial arts for your whole life or whatever. That helps, or did certainly in my path, but there's nothing to stop you from having a thoughtful take on like matches that should be made. Or there are quite a few guys out there doing prospect watches, which I can't do for the life of me. These guys are just like ear to the ground. Anyone who's coming through Russia or fucking weird ass Kazakhstani MMA circles, they're there. And they, I go to these people a lot trying to find new talent and people to be interested in and new ideas in MMA. But that's something that you can do by putting the time into and developing the skills and knowing where to get the knowledge and stuff that I can't do, and certainly other full-time writers in MMA can't do. And things like that. Just work out what you can do, craft it into an art, and hope that people want it. And then if you end up working for sites, take on the bits that they need you to do and work your way up. But first thing I would say is don't hang everything on it. Get something to get money coming in each month, obviously, so you can pay your rent or whatever. And food, obviously. Can't write very well without food. And work from there. Treat it as a side project. And then everything that goes well from there is just a bonus. You feel great about, 100 people read my article today. I still remember being like, oh my God, 1,000 people read my article over the course of this week. So my take on it's probably pretty skewed, because I sort of fell into a hole that didn't really, there weren't a lot of people doing it. But I would say develop some skills in areas that people aren't writing a lot about. Keep developing your eye for fights, which is very easy to do because you just need to keep watching fights and spotting trends, and then write competently. That's about it. But anything creative, it's almost always start on your own, don't get paid, work for a site, don't get paid, work for another site, get paid a little, and then work up from there. Cheers, Christian. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. If you want to support the podcast, get in on the Patreon, read the Pedro Munoz piece from last week and whatever we decide to do this week, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing at any time, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy, the subtlest clickbaiter in the MMA sphere, Jack Slack, and I will catch you later this week. Cheers.